the midday sun beat mercilessly upon the dusty streets of Globe, Arizona Territory, as Sheriff Ethan Mitchell made his daily rounds. At 28, he was younger than most lawmen in these parts, but the silver star on his chest had been earned through a combination of quick thinking and steady nerves that made up for his relative youth. The townsfolk had come to trust him in the 3 years since he'd taken the badge, though he could still sense the lingering doubts from some of the older residents who remembered his father, the former sheriff, with perhaps too much reverence. Today felt different, though. There was an electric tension in the air that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The mining town had grown rapidly in the past year, with the Turner Copper Company's new operations bringing in a steady stream of workers and fortune seekers. But lately, there had been whispers of trouble. Unexplained illnesses, livestock dying mysteriously, and an increasing number of prospectors abandoning their claims just outside town. The first signs of real trouble came when he spotted Benjamin Roberts, the local undertaker, struggling to keep up with an unusually high number of burials. What started as 1 or 2 deaths per week had escalated to nearly daily ceremonies with no clear cause. The town doctor, Alexander Phillips, seemed equally puzzled by the growing number of patients showing similar symptoms: severe stomach pains, fever, and a weakness that seemed to seep into their very bones. As Ethan approached the town square, he noticed a commotion growing near the general store. A crowd had gathered, their angry voices carrying on the hot desert wind. At the center of the mob stood Jacob Turner, the mine owner's son, his face red with rage as he pointed accusingly at a woman Ethan had never seen before. She stood tall and proud despite the threats being hurled at her, her dark eyes reflecting both defiance and ancient wisdom. The woman wore a mixture of traditional Apache clothing and settler garments, marking her as someone who walked between two worlds. Her name, as Ethan would soon learn, was Clara, and she had come to Globe with a warning that would shake the very foundation of the town's existence. But before she could deliver her message, Turner had accused her of being a witch, claiming she had cursed the town's water supply and was responsible for the mysterious ailments plaguing the community. Ethan pushed through the crowd just as Turner's men began to loop a rope over a sturdy oak branch. The sheriff's hand instinctively moved to his Colt revolver, but he knew drawing iron would only escalate the situation. Instead, he positioned himself between Clara and the mob, his voice cutting through the angry murmurs with the authority of his office. "This is still a town of law," he declared, "and nobody's hanging anyone without due process." The crowd's response was mixed. Some backed away immediately, respect for the badge still ingrained in their nature. Others, particularly the miners who owed their livelihood to the Turner family, stood their ground. Jacob Turner stepped forward, his expensive boots kicking up dust as he approached the sheriff. "Mitchell, this Apache witch has been seen skulking around our water supply. 3 more men died this morning. The people want justice." Clara's voice, when she finally spoke, carried a quiet strength that seemed to calm the very air around them. "Your men are dying because of poison, not magic," she said, her accent barely noticeable. "The mining operation is releasing something into the groundwater, something that kills slowly but surely. I came to warn you, to help, but it seems those responsible would rather silence the truth than face it." The revelation hit Ethan like a physical blow. If she was right, it would explain everything: the mysterious illnesses, the dead livestock, why the problems seemed to worsen as the mining operations expanded. But proving it would mean going up against the most powerful family in the territory, and he could already see in Jacob Turner's eyes that this wouldn't end peacefully. Turner's men began to spread out, forming a loose circle around Ethan and Clara. The sheriff noticed Noah Perez, his deputy, watching from the doorway of the jail across the street. With a subtle nod, Ethan signaled him to stay put. They might need backup later, but right now, escalating the situation would only lead to bloodshed. Instead, he kept his voice calm as he addressed the crowd. "Anyone who wants to file a formal complaint can do so at my office. Until then, this woman is under my protection." As the words left his mouth, Ethan knew he had just set something massive in motion. The Turner family controlled everything in Globe: the mines, the bank, most of the businesses. By standing against them publicly, he had just painted a target on his back. But looking at Clara, seeing the determination in her eyes and knowing the truth she carried could save countless lives, he knew he had made the right choice. Now they just had to survive long enough to prove it. The evening sun cast long shadows across Globe's dusty main street as Ethan guided Clara toward the jailhouse, his hand hovering near his holster. The crowd dispersed reluctantly, muttering threats and accusations, but the immediate danger had passed. Through the grimy windows of Prescott Bank, he caught glimpses of Alexander Turner's scowling face as the mine owner conferred with his associates, no doubt already plotting their next move. Inside the relative safety of the jail, Noah secured the heavy oak door while Clara sank into a wooden chair, her dark eyes fixed on the floor. The small office smelled of old coffee and gun oil, with wanted posters decorating the walls and a pot-bellied stove in the corner. Ethan noticed how she cradled her left arm, hiding an injury beneath her shawl. "I can fetch Helen from the infirmary," Noah offered, reading his boss's concern. "She's discreet, won't ask too many questions." But Clara shook her head, reaching instead into a leather pouch at her waist. She withdrew a small bundle of herbs, crushing them between her fingers before applying them to what Ethan now saw was a nasty burn along her forearm. "The mine's runoff isn't just poisoning the groundwater," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're using mercury to process the ore, dumping it directly into Cave Creek. I've treated 3 children this month alone. Symptoms that looked like cholera at first, but it's heavy metal poisoning." She met Ethan's gaze. "The Turner operation is killing this land, and everyone who depends on it." A sharp rap at the door made them all jump. Noah's hand went to his gun, but it was only Francis, the telegraph operator, looking worried. "Sheriff, just got a wire from Flagstaff. Turner's men sent messages to some hired guns. They're bringing in professionals from up north." She handed Ethan the yellow slip of paper, her hands trembling slightly. Ethan scanned the telegram, his jaw tightening. 3 names stood out. Notorious gunmen he'd heard whispered about in saloons from Yuma to Prescott. This wasn't just about silencing one Apache healer anymore. Turner was preparing for war. "How long?" he asked Francis. "Train arrives tomorrow noon," she replied. "I'm sorry, Sheriff. I'd have warned you sooner, but they've been watching the office." She glanced nervously at Clara before hurrying back out into the gathering dusk. Noah paced the small office, his spurs jingling. "We could try getting word to the marshal in Prescott, but—" Ethan cut him off with a shake of his head. 3 days ride at best. We need proof now, something concrete enough to force the territorial governor to act." Clara stood, gathering her shawl around her shoulders. "I know where they dump the worst of it. There's a hidden ravine past the North Ridge. That's where I found the dead cattle that first made me suspicious. But Turner's men patrol it heavily." She hesitated. "And there's something else. The old medicine man who trained me, Benjamin, he disappeared 3 weeks ago after telling me he was going to investigate the site." Ethan shared a knowing look with Noah. They'd found a body in the desert last month, too decomposed to identify. Now the pieces were falling into place, painting an ugly picture of just how far the Turners would go to protect their secrets. "We'll need help," Noah said quietly. "Someone who knows the land, who Turner's men won't be watching for." Ethan nodded, already forming a plan. "Send word to Anna at the mission. She works with the local tribes, might know someone who can guide us in without being seen." He turned to Clara. "Meanwhile, you're staying here where it's safe. Noah will stand guard." But Clara's expression hardened with determination. "My people have watched this poison spread through our sacred lands for too long. I won't hide while others risk their lives to expose the truth." She touched the leather pouch at her waist. "Besides, you'll need my knowledge to prove what they're doing. The signs are there if you know how to read them." The last rays of sunlight faded from the office windows as Ethan weighed his options. Every instinct told him to protect Clara, to keep her safely locked away until this was over. But she was right. They needed her expertise, and time was running out. By this time tomorrow, Turner's hired guns would arrive, and their chances of gathering evidence would vanish like morning mist in the desert heat. Sheriff Ethan Mitchell squinted against the harsh afternoon sun as he led his horse through the winding streets of Prescott. The medicine woman, Clara, walked silently beside him, her dark eyes scanning the weathered buildings with a mixture of wariness and determination. Just hours ago, he'd pulled her from the grip of an angry mob outside Turner's general store, where she'd been accused of witchcraft after warning townsfolk about their contaminated water supply. The young lawman couldn't shake the unsettling images she'd shown him: dead livestock by the creek, strange metallic residue coating the stones, and most disturbing of all, the sickly pallor creeping across the faces of Prescott's children. Clara had traced it all back to the Phoenix Mining Company's new operation in the hills, but Alexander Turner, the mine's owner, wielded too much influence for a simple accusation to stick. Inside the sheriff's office, Clara spread her collection of dried herbs across his desk, explaining how certain plants could detect poison in water. Ethan found himself drawn to her quiet confidence, so different from the hysterical witch they'd painted her to be. A knock at the door made them both freeze. It was Benjamin Roberts, the town doctor, his usually pristine shirt stained with vomit. "Sheriff, we've got 3 more cases of the sickness. Whatever this is, it's spreading." That evening, Ethan and Clara rode out to the creek feeding Prescott's reservoir. The setting sun painted the desert in shades of blood and gold, but they focused on the unnatural blue-green tinge of the water. Clara dismounted, kneeling to examine some withered vegetation. "Look here," she said, pointing to crystalline deposits on the plants. "This is no natural formation. The mine is dumping something toxic into the watershed." They followed the creek's course upstream, the moon rising as they approached the mine's property. The sound of approaching horses sent them scrambling for cover behind a cluster of boulders. Through the darkness, they watched as workers emptied barrels of something that gleamed sickeningly in the moonlight into the stream. Ethan's hand moved to his gun, but Clara gripped his arm. "Not yet," she whispered. "We need proof that will stand in court." Back in town, they found Noah Phillips, the telegraph operator, slumped over his desk. He was alive, but barely conscious, a half-empty glass of water beside him. Clara mixed a poultice from her herbs while Ethan searched the office, finding a crumpled telegram warning of their investigation. The message was signed by Jacob Turner, Alexander's brother and the mine's foreman. They were being watched. The next morning brought more sick townspeople to Dr. Roberts' clinic. Helen Perez, the schoolteacher, reported half her students too ill to attend classes. The town council, led by Alexander Turner himself, called an emergency meeting. Ethan watched from the back as Turner blamed the sickness on foreign influences, while shooting pointed looks at Clara, who stood quietly beside the sheriff, documenting every word. Frances Mitchell, Ethan's sister and the local newspaper editor, worked through the night printing pamphlets about the water contamination. But when they went to distribute them, they found Turner's men had already spread their own version of events, painting Clara as a troublemaker trying to destroy the town's prosperity. The mining company's grip on Prescott was tighter than they'd realized. A shot rang out as they left the newspaper office, the bullet splintering the doorframe inches from Clara's head. Ethan drew his gun and fired back, catching a glimpse of a figure disappearing down an alley. Inside Clara's medicine bag, they found a crude warning carved into her wooden mortar: "Leave town or die." But the threat only strengthened their resolve to expose the truth. That night, under cover of darkness, they met with Dr. Roberts and Francis in the back room of the newspaper office. The doctor had compiled records of the spreading illness, while Francis had uncovered documents showing similar incidents at other Phoenix Mining Company operations. Clara added her own observations about the contamination's unique signature. The evidence was mounting, but they needed something irrefutable to break Turner's hold on the town. Alice Turner, Alexander's wife, arrived at the sheriff's office the next morning, her face hidden beneath a heavy veil. She revealed that her husband had been secretly buying up property from families forced to leave town due to the sickness. The mining company planned to expand once Prescott was emptied, but as she spoke, they heard the approaching thunder of hoofbeats. Turner's men had discovered her betrayal. The thundering hooves grew closer as Ethan quickly ushered Alice through the back door of his office. Clara emerged from the shadows, pressing a small leather pouch into Alice's trembling hands. "Crushed sage and creosote bush," she whispered. "It will mask your scent from their tracking horses." The 3 slipped into the narrow alley between buildings as Turner's men clattered down the main street, their horses' iron shoes striking sparks from the packed earth. As they crouched behind stacked crates, Ethan could feel Clara's quiet strength beside him. The medicine woman had proven herself far more than just a healer. She was becoming the heart of their resistance against the mining company's deadly schemes. Alice clutched the documents she'd stolen from her husband's safe, papers that detailed the systematic poisoning of Prescott's watershed and the cold calculation behind it. The search party passed, and they made their way through the pre-dawn shadows to Francis's newspaper office. The journalist's eyes widened at the sight of Turner's wife, but she quickly ushered them inside. The printing press stood silent, covered in a film of desert dust. "They've cut off my paper supply," Francis explained bitterly. "But I've sent riders to Flagstaff. We'll have what we need by week's end." Days passed like molten glass, slow and dangerous. More townspeople fell ill, and Dr. Roberts worked himself to exhaustion treating them. Clara mixed her traditional remedies with his Western medicines, creating treatments that helped ease the suffering but couldn't cure the source. The water from every well in Prescott carried the mining company's poison, and the summer heat made rationing the remaining clean water nearly impossible. Ethan received word that Turner had sent telegrams to hired guns in Yuma, offering blood money for anyone who could solve his Apache problem. The sheriff stationed deputies at every road into town, but he knew professional killers would find ways past such obvious defenses. Clara refused to leave, even when Ethan told her about the bounty on her head. "My people have faced worse than gunmen," she said, grinding medicines by candlelight. "The earth itself cries out for justice." Alice proved invaluable, knowing her husband's habits and methods. She revealed that Turner kept his most damning records in a safe at the mining company's assay office in Globe. The documents there would prove he'd known about the contamination for months, even as he assured the townspeople their water was clean. But Globe was 2 days' hard ride through Apache territory, and Turner's men watched every trail. They found an unlikely ally in Noah, the old stablemaster who'd lost his wife to the contaminated water. His knowledge of hidden trails and water sources could get them to Globe undetected. But time was running out, the summer heat was rising, and more children were being brought to Dr. Roberts with symptoms of poisoning. The town's clean water supplies were dwindling, and Turner's men had begun guarding the remaining good wells. Late one night, as they planned their raid on the assay office, Clara went rigid. Her eyes grew distant, and she spoke of spirits warning her of betrayal from within their circle. Someone was feeding information to Turner, someone close to their group. The revelation cast a shadow over their preparations, forcing them to guard their words even among friends. Trust, already fragile in the poisoned town, became as precious as clean water. Francis discovered that Turner had also bought the Globe newspaper, ensuring no stories about similar contamination cases would reach Prescott. The web of corruption stretched across the territory, protected by money and violence. But now, they had Alice's testimony, Clara's evidence of the poison's unique signature, and the doctor's records of its effects. They just needed the proof locked away in Globe to break Turner's grip on Prescott. As they prepared for the dangerous journey, Ethan noticed how Clara watched the sunrise each morning, singing soft prayers in Apache. She'd taught him to see the desert differently, not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a living thing wounded by men's greed. The poison in the water was just another weapon in the long war against the land itself. Together, they had to find a way to heal both the people and the earth that sustained them. The journey to Globe would take them through some of the most treacherous territory in Arizona. Ethan and Clara loaded their supplies before dawn, while Frances arranged for a trusted friend to maintain her careful documentation of new illness cases in Prescott. The evidence they'd gathered was sewn into the lining of Clara's medicine bag. Turner's men would never think to search an Apache woman's sacred items. As they rode southeast, the desert landscape shifted from redstone formations to rolling hills dotted with mesquite. Clara pointed out medicinal plants along the way, teaching Ethan which ones could help treat the symptoms they'd been seeing in Prescott. Her knowledge of both worlds, Apache medicine and Western science, had already saved lives. But Ethan noticed how she grew quieter as they moved further from her traditional lands. The first attempt on their lives came at sunset near an abandoned stage station. The shots rang out just as they were making camp, forcing them to scatter into the rocks. Ethan recognized one of Turner's hired guns from Prescott. The man had been watching Francis's office for weeks. Clara's quick thinking saved them, using smoke signals to make it appear a large Apache party was approaching. The sun had begun its descent behind the red cliffs surrounding Globe when Sheriff Ethan Mitchell and Francis Perez crouched behind an overturned wagon near the mine entrance. The Apache medicine woman's dark eyes were fixed on the armed men patrolling the wooden walkways above, her fingers tracing symbols in the dust as she whispered ancient prayers. Ethan's hand rested on his Colt, knowing they had only one chance to expose the mining company's deadly scheme before more townspeople succumbed to the poisoned water. Through the lengthening shadows, they watched Alexander Turner, the mine owner, directing his men to dump more chemical-laden barrels into the underground stream that fed Globe's wells. Francis had discovered the truth when treating mysterious illnesses in town. The mining operation was using a new extraction process that leached toxic metals into the groundwater. But Turner's influence ran deep, and he'd already sent 3 assassins to silence them. The evening wind carried the acrid smell of sulfur and coal smoke as Ethan studied the mine's defenses. 20 armed men, strategically positioned walkways, and powder kegs ready to collapse the main shaft if needed. Yet they had one advantage: Francis's knowledge of the old Apache tunnels that honeycombed these hills, passages that could get them inside undetected. The question was whether they could gather enough evidence before Turner realized they'd infiltrated his operation. "The spirits are restless tonight," Francis whispered, her weathered face grave in the fading light. "They sense death approaching." She wasn't referring to the townspeople dying slowly from contaminated water, but to the violence that would soon erupt. Ethan had seen enough bloodshed to know she was right. This wouldn't end without bullets flying. The weight of his badge felt especially heavy as he considered how many lives hung in the balance. Under cover of darkness, they made their way to a narrow crevice Francis had shown him earlier. The passage was barely wide enough for Ethan's shoulders, forcing them to move sideways through the twisting rock. Francis led the way, her steps sure despite the pitch blackness. The air grew thick with mineral dust that caught in their throats, but neither dared cough and risk detection. Above, they could hear the heavy boots of Turner's men making their rounds. They emerged into a small cavern lit by distant lantern light, filtering through wooden support beams. Francis pointed to a stack of documents on a crude desk. Ledgers detailing chemical purchases and correspondence about the new extraction process. But before they could reach them, a voice rang out. "I figured you'd try something like this, Mitchell." Alexander Turner stepped from the shadows, flanked by his enforcer, Jacob Phillips, both men leveling rifles at their chests. "You're a fool if you think you can stop progress," Turner sneered, his expensive suit incongruous in the rough-hewn chamber. "This territory needs this mine. A few dead Indians and settlers are a small price to pay." The casual cruelty in his voice made Ethan's blood boil, but Francis remained eerily calm, her hands making subtle gestures he'd learned to watch for. She was preparing something, and he needed to keep Turner talking. Suddenly, the cavern erupted in chaos. Francis threw a handful of powder that burst into blinding white smoke, while simultaneously, explosions rocked the tunnels above. The Apache woman had arranged for her people to attack the mine's surface operations as a diversion. In the confusion, Ethan tackled Turner while Francis snatched the incriminating documents. Phillips fired blindly, his shot sparking off stone walls as they retreated into the passage. The chase through the tunnels became a desperate game of cat and mouse. Turner's men pursued with torches, their shadows dancing grotesquely on the rock walls. Francis led them through a maze of turns, but their pursuers knew the mine's layout well. Bullets whizzed past as they ran, the sound echoing deafeningly in the confined space. Ethan returned fire when he could, more to slow their attackers than with any hope of hitting them in the chaos. Above ground, the Apache raid had drawn most of Turner's forces away from the mine entrance, but as Ethan and Francis emerged into the night air, they found themselves facing Noah Roberts, Turner's master tracker, who'd been hunting them for days. The grizzled man had his rifle trained on them with rock-steady hands. "Drop those papers," he growled, "or I'll put you both in the ground right here." What happened next would be talked about in Globe for years to come. Francis began to chant, her voice carrying an otherworldly power that made the very air seem to vibrate. The ground trembled, and suddenly the hillside behind Roberts collapsed, unleashing a torrent of poisoned water from a buried reservoir. The toxic flood swept through the mining camp, destroying equipment and forcing Turner's men to flee for their lives. In the aftermath, as federal marshals arrived to investigate, the truth about Globe's water supply couldn't be ignored. Turner and his conspirators were arrested, their operation shut down, but the victory came at a cost. Francis's people would never fully trust the white settlers again, and the land itself would take years to heal. Ethan kept the Apache medicine woman's secret about how she'd known where to collapse the hillside, understanding that some mysteries of the old ways were better left unspoken. As dawn broke over Globe, Ethan and Francis stood on the sheriff's office porch, watching workers begin the process of cleaning up the mine site. Their unlikely partnership had saved the town, but both knew things would never be quite the same. The frontier was changing, and with it the delicate balance between progress and preservation. Francis touched the sheriff's arm gently before walking away toward the rising sun, leaving him to ponder the true cost of justice in a land where old and new worlds collided. In the weeks that followed the mine's closure, Globe struggled to rebuild. The town's water supply slowly cleared, but the shadow of Turner's betrayal hung heavy over the community. Ethan found himself busier than ever, mediating disputes between miners who'd lost their jobs and townspeople who blamed them for enabling Turner's schemes. Through it all, he couldn't shake the memory of Frances disappearing into the sunrise, carrying with her secrets he'd only begun to understand. When Benjamin, the young telegraph operator, burst into his office one morning with news from Prescott, Ethan's world shifted again. Similar mining operations had been discovered in 3 other territories, all connected to Turner's network. The conspiracy ran deeper than anyone had imagined, and somewhere in the maze of shell companies and false names lay a truth that could shake the entire Arizona territory. Frances returned unexpectedly one night, slipping into town like a shadow. She brought word that her people had found more contaminated springs on their ancestral lands, marking a pattern that stretched from Globe to Flagstaff. The medicine woman's dark eyes held a mixture of anger and determination as she spread a hand-drawn map across Ethan's desk, turquoise bracelets clicking softly in the lamplight. Together, they traced the evidence through dusty land office records and telegraph correspondence. Alexander, the town's bookkeeper, joined their investigation, his careful documentation revealing a web of corruption that reached into the territorial government itself. Each new discovery painted a picture of systematic exploitation that had been years in the making. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Clara, the widow who ran Globe's general store, remembered letters her late husband had mentioned. Correspondence about mineral rights dating back a decade. Hidden in a false-bottom trunk, the yellowed papers provided the final link they needed, connecting Turner to a shadowy consortium based in Yuma. As they closed in on the truth, the danger mounted. 2 attempts were made on Ethan's life, once on the trail to Prescott, and again in the alley behind the sheriff's office. Frances' traditional medicines saved him both times, though she refused to explain exactly what was in the bitter teas she made him drink. The conspirators made their final move during the harvest moon. A dozen hired guns rode into Globe, led by Noah, Turner's former foreman who'd escaped during the initial arrests. They expected to find a vulnerable town. Instead, they met a prepared resistance, townspeople and Apache warriors standing together, guided by Frances' wisdom and Ethan's strategy. The battle for Globe's future unfolded in the pre-dawn hours, gunfire echoing off the canyon walls. Frances moved through the chaos like a spirit, using her knowledge of the land to help Ethan's deputies outmaneuver the attackers. When Noah's men tried to set fire to the water tower, they found themselves caught in a trap of their own making. In the end, it was Helen, the schoolteacher, who delivered the final blow to the conspiracy. Her careful records of children's illnesses, mapped against water sources, provided irrefutable evidence that forced the territorial governor to act. The entire network was exposed, leading to arrests across Arizona territory. Standing once again on the sheriff's office porch, Ethan watched as Frances taught a group of town children about desert plants that could purify water. The barrier between their worlds hadn't disappeared, but something new had grown in its place. A fragile understanding that perhaps the old ways and the new could find common ground. The last of Turner's men faced justice in Prescott's courthouse, but the real healing happened in the quiet moments. Shared meals between settlers and Apache families, knowledge exchanged about the land they all now called home, and a growing recognition that survival in this harsh territory required more than just law books and six-shooters. As summer faded into fall, Globe began to change. The mine reopened under new management, with strict oversight and regular testing of the water supply. Frances established a healing center where both native and settler medicines were practiced, a living symbol of the bridge they'd built between cultures. And Ethan kept her feather on his desk, a reminder that true justice sometimes required looking beyond the letter of the law to the spirit of the land itself. Sheriff Ethan Mitchell stood atop the hill overlooking Globe, watching the first rays of dawn paint the desert mountains in shades of amber and rose. The medicine woman, Clara, crouched beside him, her weathered hands tracing patterns in the red dust as she mixed herbs from her deerskin pouch. 3 days had passed since they'd discovered the mining company's deadly secret, mercury and arsenic deliberately dumped into the town's water supply to drive out the remaining homesteaders who refused to sell their land. "The spirits are restless tonight," Clara whispered, her dark eyes reflecting the emerging stars. "Many more will die if we don't act soon." She had taught Ethan to see beyond his white man's prejudices, showing him how the land itself kept score of humanity's transgressions. The dying vegetation around the creek told a story that no amount of Benjamin Turner's money could silence. From their vantage point, they could see the armed guards patrolling the mine entrance, their rifles glinting in the fading light. Alexander Phillips, Turner's head of security, had already sent 2 failed assassination attempts their way. The first had been a clumsy ambush on the trail to Prescott, the second a poisoned bottle of whiskey left in Ethan's office. Both times, Clara's wisdom had saved them. Down in Globe, more townspeople had fallen ill. Frances Roberts, the school teacher, had collapsed during lessons yesterday, blood trickling from her nose. Helen Turner, Benjamin's own wife, lay bedridden with the same symptoms, though her husband still denied any connection to the mine's operations. The town doctor, Jacob Perez, worked tirelessly, but without knowing the true cause, his treatments offered little help. "We have the evidence now," Ethan said, patting the saddlebag containing water samples and Clara's detailed drawings of the contamination's spread. "But Turner owns the telegraph office and half the county officials. Even if we could get word out, who would believe us in time?" He watched as another funeral procession wound its way to the cemetery, the third this week. Clara's fingers brushed his arm, leaving traces of medicinal powder on his sleeve. "There is another way," she said. "My people know of underground springs, pure water that flows beneath the sacred mountains. If we can lead the townspeople there, away from Turner's poison, they will live long enough to see justice done." Her plan was dangerous. Moving sick people through Apache territory would draw attention from both sides. That night, they began secretly evacuating the weakest patients first. Noah Phillips, Alexander's younger brother who had turned against the mining company after discovering their crimes, helped them smuggle small groups past the guards. They used Clara's knowledge of hidden trails and Ethan's authority as sheriff to create a cover story about quarantine measures. The deception worked until Anna Mitchell, Ethan's sister, was caught helping Helen Turner escape her mansion. Benjamin Turner flew into a rage, finally revealing his true nature to the remaining townspeople as he ordered his men to shoot anyone trying to leave Globe. The night erupted in chaos as families fled in all directions, some falling to gunfire while others vanished into the darkness. Clara led the main group toward the springs while Ethan and Noah stayed behind to hold off Turner's men. The battle for Globe became legend, not for its gunplay but for how it ended. As dawn approached, the mine's own poisoned water became its undoing. Turner, in his madness, had been drinking it for days, believing himself immune. They found him collapsed in his office, his ledgers containing proof of every death he'd orchestrated. Weeks later, as federal marshals finally arrived to investigate, Globe was already transforming. The survivors had built a new settlement near Clara's Springs, where Apache and settler alike shared the clean water. Helen Turner, recovered from her illness, used her husband's fortune to establish a hospital where Clara could teach traditional healing alongside modern medicine. Ethan often stood on a different hill now, watching the sunset paint the new town in familiar shades of gold. Clara would join him sometimes, speaking of how the land had balanced its accounts. The old mining camp stood abandoned, nature slowly reclaiming its scars. They had discovered that true justice, like healing, required more than force. It needed wisdom drawn from both worlds, flowing pure and clean like the hidden springs that had saved them all. The story of Globe's poisoning became a cautionary tale throughout the territory, but few knew the full truth. How an Apache medicine woman and a young sheriff had found strength in their differences, or how their unlikely alliance had transformed not just a town, but the very notion of what it meant to protect and serve on the frontier. In the end, the most powerful weapon against greed hadn't been bullets or badges, but the simple truth that all life depends on clean water, flowing free. Years after the Globe incident, word spread through the territory of how the town had been transformed. Where toxic mine tailings once stained the earth, gardens now flourished under Clara's guidance. The Apache healer had taught the townspeople to work with the land rather than against it, using traditional methods to purify soil and restore native plants that naturally filtered the groundwater. Ethan watched with quiet pride as Globe became known not for its mines, but for its healing springs. The mining company's collapse had rippled through the territory, exposing similar operations in Prescott and Flagstaff. Former mine owner Alexander had fled east, but his conscience eventually drove him to send detailed letters confessing the full scope of the conspiracy. The documents revealed a network of corrupt officials who had helped conceal the poisoning, leading to a wave of reforms across Arizona territory. Justice, like the desert plants Clara tended, had taken root slowly but grew strong. Clara's position in Globe had evolved from outsider to respected elder. She established a school where both native and settler children learned the delicate balance between progress and preservation. The sight of young ones gathering medicinal herbs alongside their reading lessons became common, breaking down barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. Even the most hardened skeptics couldn't deny the wisdom in her methods when the town's health flourished while others struggled. Ethan's own transformation ran deeper than his role as sheriff. The young man who had once seen justice only through the lens of law now understood the profound connection between the health of the land and its people. He and Clara often traveled to neighboring settlements, sharing their story and helping other communities detect and prevent similar environmental threats. Their partnership became legendary, though few knew the personal cost they had both paid in those early days. The old mining camp stood as a monument to change, its rusted machinery slowly disappearing beneath desert flowers. Clara had shown Ethan how the native plants could detect poison in the soil, their growth patterns telling stories that no assayer's report could reveal. This knowledge saved 3 other towns from similar fates, as they learned to read the land's warnings before disaster struck. The territory's marshals began consulting both lawmen and healers when investigating suspicious mining claims. Helen, who had lost her husband to the poisoned water, became Globe's first female council member. She worked tirelessly to establish new laws protecting water rights and requiring regular testing of wells. The policies she championed spread across the territory, though she always credited Clara's wisdom for showing them the way. The two women formed an unlikely friendship that helped bridge the remaining gaps between native and settler communities. Frances, the schoolteacher who had first supported Clara during the crisis, expanded her curriculum to include environmental stewardship alongside traditional subjects. Her students learned to test water quality using both scientific methods and traditional indicators, creating a new generation of vigilant protectors. The school became a model for others, proving that progress didn't require abandoning wisdom passed down through generations. As Globe prospered, other towns sought to replicate its success. Ethan and Clara found themselves traveling more frequently, though they always returned to the hills where their unlikely alliance had begun. They watched young Apache healers working alongside doctors in the new hospital, sharing knowledge that benefited all. The town's water ran clean and clear, carrying stories of transformation to settlements downstream. The desert itself seemed to approve of the changes, blessing Globe with unusually abundant springs. Clara explained how the land remembered those who protected it, though Ethan had learned enough by then to understand such mysteries without requiring scientific proof. They had created something rare and precious, a place where different worlds met as equals, bound together by the simple truth that life's most essential elements belong to no one and everyone. In the end, the story of Globe became more than a tale of environmental justice. It demonstrated how crisis could forge connections stronger than prejudice, and how ancient wisdom combined with modern knowledge could light the way forward. Ethan and Clara's legacy lived on in every clean stream and healthy child, in every shared meal between former enemies, and in the deep understanding that true protection meant guarding not just lives, but the very sources of life itself.